Let's talk about using the meter now. How do I set the meter? How do I use the meter to set my aperture and shutter speed actually? When I touch this trigger here, the trigger that I shoot with, the shutter release, the meter turns on. And you'll notice that as I go through my shutter speeds, the meter is telling me I'm letting in more light right now. And here the meter is telling me I'm letting in less light. As I start going to faster shutter speeds, I'm letting in less light. So let me go back up. Now if I hit 0, typically under normal conditions, outdoors in daylight is normal conditions. If I were to shoot right now, I'd get a good shot. I'd get a good exposure. Unless I've got too much brightness or too much darkness, and we'll talk about that later. So right now if I shot this, two things would happen. I get proper exposure, but look at my shutter speed. I'm shooting at 1/8 of a second. If I'm on a tripod, I won't have any camera shake. That'll be good. But if something is moving, maybe my 1/8 of a second will give me motion blur that I don't want. So I've got proper exposure, but I got to be aware of what my settings are before I shoot. So I'm going to change my settings. I'm going to go to a faster shutter speed. Let's go up to something that I know I can hand hold. I was going the wrong way. Let's go up to 1/60th of a second. That's something I can commonly hand hold with this camera. The meter is now telling me that I'm way past -3. I don't have any light coming into this meter according to the meter. What I have to do is change my aperture to make up for that. I hold down the AV button and I start opening up my shutter, my aperture rather. Start opening up my aperture. And notice that the light meter now has been zeroed. It slowly crept up. At 1/60th, at f4, the meter says go ahead, it's at 0. And if I shoot the picture, again under normal conditions, I'll get proper exposure. Now I know that holding it at 1/60th of a second, there's no chance that I can, or there's less chance that I'll give it camera shake, and maybe there'll be motion blur will be controlled. So you got to pay attention to what your settings are. When you set the meter to 0, I've got 1/60th at f4. Now I've got that range that I could talk about, equivalent exposures. If I make a change to the shutter speed, I'm going to start adding light. I'm making the shutter speed longer. Notice that I've gone one stop into the plus area. To make up for that, I'm going to try to set my aperture to a smaller number so that it retains equivalent exposure. So I'm going to start going the other way. So now I've got 1/30th at f5.6. That's an equivalent exposure to the one that I had earlier, 1/60th at f4. Those are equivalent exposures. They both meter out at 0, and therefore I know that same amount of light is coming in with this equation. Let me go again. Shutter speed. I'm going to add light, one stop more light. I'm at 1/15th of a second. Now I'm above 0 by one stop. To make up for that, I can close down the aperture again. Now I'm at 1/15th at f8. Same exposure. So I've got equivalent exposures with these things. So the lesson here is 0 the meter for outdoors normal conditions. Outdoors in sunlight is normal conditions. And if you're not shooting something that's pure white or pure black or has a lot of brightness outdoors, then your meter will typically give you a good exposure. The idea is to 0 the meter, shoot at 0, and then adjust accordingly. If you realize that you've got too little exposure, override the meter. Go ahead and override it, add more exposure and shoot. So the meter gives us typically a ballpark, and that ballpark is usually pretty good under normal conditions. But sometimes the meter can be fooled.